Welcome, everybody. We'll get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. My name is Lisa Gillis, and I'm an account manager with the Hypothesis team. I'm very excited to be introducing the next session, Annotation for Inclusive, Accessible, and Emotionally Supportive Learning in Asynchronous Courses, led by Amy Mangridge, Julia Roberto, and Linnea Lestadius from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Before we begin, I'm just going to remind everyone that has already been to a session and let everyone know that has not been to a session that if you need to access the closed captioning button, it's along the bottom toolbar of the Zoom screen. You can also find a Q&A, question and answer button there where you can enter any questions that you might have throughout these sessions, and our panelists will do our best to get to all of them before the end of the session. That's all for me. I'm now going to pass it over to our presenters so they can begin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're happy to be here. We have a little quick introduction and then we're going to get started. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Amy Mangridge. I'm the Interim Executive Director of UWM Online. And in this role, we've been working for several years to convert a number of programs at UWM to online format, to fully online programs. And in the process of doing that, I've worked with Julia and Linnea for quite a long time now. And so we've been working with the Hypothesis, and we're excited to share some of our work with you. Julia in the role of instructional design, and Linnea as a faculty member. So I'll turn it over to Julia to introduce herself, and then to Linnea.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Roberto. Like Amy said, I've been an instructional designer with UWM throughout this process. I've worked closely with Amy and faculty like Dr. Lestadius to support the course redesign, especially thinking through accessibility and inclusive pedagogy. And Linnea, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Linnea Lestadius. I'm an associate professor of public health policy at the Zilber College of Public Health. And we've been moving, as mentioned, a lot of classes fully online. And it's been really helpful to work with this great support and also to use tools like Hypothesis to make this happen.
Great. All right, so today what we're going to work on and talk about in our session are some key frameworks about universal design and socio-emotional learning. Julia is going to cover that with her expertise. We'll talk about cognitive overload specifically, or cognitive load overload specifically, and some examples of some of the ways that Hypothesis has been used to combat those sorts of issues. We'll talk about social annotation, specifically about how Hypothesis can help address some of those challenges. And then if we've got a little bit of time at the end, we'll talk about how this can be applied to other disciplines outside of the ones that we are giving examples about, and give you a little bit of help and information about how you can apply this to your own courses or your own work. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Amy. We can see the Brave Space assignment.
Oh, I'm so sorry. My apologies. Hang on one second. I'm talking along like everybody can see what I'm doing. Let's see. Actually, I'm just going to share my screen. I think that might be a little bit easier way to do this. All right, how about that? Is that better?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Appreciate that. All right, Julia, take it away.
Okay, amazing. So we're going to start out with the foundations. In this initial part of the session, we just want to orient you with the two frameworks that have shaped most of our course redesign work. Our two frameworks today are going to be universal design for learning and social emotional learning. Together, these frameworks give us both the why and the how for designing courses that meet diverse student needs. And they're especially important when we start to consider the unique challenges faced in online learning environments. For us, these aren't just theories that we use to check a box. They're the lenses that inform the curriculum. Universal design for learning specifically helps us recognize that students bring all kinds of variability to the learning environment. They have differences in their background, in their processing, in their access needs. motivation. And it really pushed us to ask the question, how do we design from the start so that all students can get the information being presented to them? How do we ensure that they remain engaged? And how do we offer multiple ways of assessing that they've learned the materials? Of course, access is only one part of the equation. Social emotional learning then reminds us that emotions, relationships, and students' identity are all conditions that make learning possible for each student. And in online courses where students often feel very isolated, it becomes even more critical to build in these opportunities. This framework calls for these 5 different buckets that can be used to help students succeed in the learning environment. Next slide, please. And so the next part is that UDL and SEL give us the theory, but to understand how to apply them, we need to talk about one of the biggest barriers in online learning, which is the idea of cognitive load and cognitive overload. So cognitive load is about how much information our brains can handle at any given time. There's intrinsic load, which is just about the material or the curriculum itself. Some content is just objectively hard, like learning statistics or analyzing qualitative data. But then when we layer on things like disorganized pages on Canvas or unclear assignments with no rubrics or heavy readings with no support, that is extraneous load. And that's where we as educators can intervene. Because our goal is to reduce that unnecessary complexity and free up space for germane load, which is the productive kind of effort where students are using their brain power to build knowledge and make meaningful connections. But when that balance is off, we start to tip it over into what is called cognitive load. This is when the resources needed to process information are greater than what students have available to them. That could be time, clarity, their emotional energy, their executive functioning. That's why you wouldn't teach a child to ride a bicycle while you're also quizzing them on multiplication tables. It would be too much happening at once. And online learning can really feel that way for some of our students. There can be disjointed readings, unclear expectations, and just a lack of space to pause and reflect. And now, speaking of cognitive overload, here's a bunch of text for you to process at once. But this is where things get really important. Not all of our students are dealing with the same baseline of stress or support. Some come in already maxed out just because of how their brains work, how their identities are positioned in academia, or what they have access to outside of the classroom. And our most vulnerable students are particularly affected by this in online classrooms. Students with disabilities, both visible and invisible, struggle at higher rates in online classrooms. And our first generation students are often facing access issues. And then, most shockingly, almost half of students right now are suffering from loneliness and isolation that is preventing them from performing most successfully in colleges and universities. And this brings us to the big question. If these are challenges and these are frameworks, what do we actually do in practice? The frameworks shift this responsibility onto us as educators to intentionally plan in advance for students' strengths and needs. And then hypothesis comes in where it's not just a technical tool, it is a space where students can slow down, think together, ask questions, and feel seen in a classroom that is asynchronous. It helps us move from those principles and putting them into action directly onto the reading experience. And I will pass it over to Amy to go further with that.
Sounds good. So with social annotation, it's an amazing tool. Hypothesis, I think, is an amazing tool. I'll just give you a little bit of information about my work with Hypothesis over the years. So UWM adopted Hypothesis about 6 years ago or so, and it's been an incredible tool. Students really appreciate this tool, especially at the graduate level. Both of the courses that we're going to talk about today and use as examples both come from the graduate level courses, and they're both from programs that are fully online programs. So the students are in cohorts that they never see each other face to face. And so some of the great things about social annotation is it fits completely into what Julia was describing earlier with SEL and universal design, and that is bringing students together into these conversations, and it's within the context of the readings itself, or within, in recent cases, also in video transcripts as well. So it's bringing students together to have conversations within the context of the content. And so fits in very, very well with a lot of the points that Julia was just making. So let me give you an example from one of our courses. This is from a Master's of Social Work course. This is a course that happens in the second or third semester of the cohort. This particular program moves their students through in cohorts. So they all start out together and move through together through the whole program. So this is a cultural diversity in social work course, and it addresses a lot of sensitive topics, things that that students can feel uncomfortable about, or things related to like trauma, diversity, equity, inclusion, equity. So there's some potential to have difficult conversations. And so the instructor, as they were moving from a face-to-face environment into the online environment, was trying to figure out, how do I do what we do in our face-to-face class, where we come up with a list of agreements that we will all work toward in the semester. How do I do that exercise with my students in the online environment? In the face-to-face environment, it makes sense, we can have these conversations, but how do I do that in the online environment? And so we worked through a bunch of options, and Hypothesis ended up to be the best possible solution. And in fact, we have a lot of feedback from the students that are indicating that this is actually working really well for them, and that from the instructor's perspective, it actually works better in the Hypothesis environment than it does even in the face-to-face, because in the face-to-face, they see each other and there's still a sense of social intimidation, or there's a social aspect to it. Whereas in the Hypothesis environment, there's enough of a distance, they can still be honest and they can still let their voices be heard, but there's enough of a distance that it allows them to even be more free with their thoughts and their expressions. So this particular assignment is broken down into 3 main parts, and annotation is used in two of the parts. So the first part, the students are reading a particular document, a particular article assigned by the instructor that talks about what they call brave spaces. And then they annotate that, and I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. They annotate that, and then they work on a self-reflection where they identify for themselves what are the things that make an environment, or especially a classroom environment, a brave space or a safe space, or a brave space is what they're calling it. And then they work in dyads with another partner, and they do this in a synchronous session. So they go into a Zoom meeting together, the two of them, and they talk through what each one of their ideas about brave spaces are, and then they develop a list based on their own conversation about what should be included in the course's brave space list. And then finally, the instructor puts together this list and aggregates this list from all of the groups, the dyads, and the student, and post that to the students, and then the students annotate on that list. So let me show you what this sort of looks like. The first assignment, again, it's annotating the article. It's asking the students to, and what you'll notice here is that these are very open-ended. It's asking, what are the distinctions that the authors is using between the brave space and the safe space, and what are some of the common rules that the instructor or the author is describing. And then, so here's an example of what the students did. So they're going through and they're identifying places in the text that resonate with them personally about what a brave space means. And so I like this quote. So while working to come up with an example of a brave space within this class, this is exactly what I had in mind. The process of using this for the class to set up these agreements is a great idea. And then there's some replies here. This is a particular rule that I really like. I agree. This is also a rule that seems important in my mind, especially in this case with a collective of a pool of a diverse pool. So they go through this, and then they do their own self-reflection. So let me go back here. So here's the self-reflection. What does a brave space look like to you in the class? What are the agreements that you'd like to have included? And then they meet with their partner. And like I mentioned, they get together, they work for 60 minutes to come up with a set of agreements. And then the instructor goes through and establishes this list, and then just writes it up in a Word document and posts it back to the students. Then the students go back individually again and comment on that list. What's one agreement that you feel is really important? And then some optional questions about concerns you have with any of the agreements. And so this is what it looks like this is what it looks like in one of the classes. So again, listing all of the agreements, and then the students are commenting on those agreements. So yeah, essentially, this was a great opportunity, I think, for the students to come together with a collective agreement. It has a lot of community building and, again, establishing this set of rules that they can work with for the rest of the semester. So now I'm going to turn it over to Linnea to talk about her example.
Great, thank you, Amy. So this one is from a graduate level qualitative methods class. And so if you've ever taken qualitative methods, you know that that first stage where you learn coding can feel very overwhelming because there's a lot of ambiguity involved. And so previously, this was a synchronous activity where people talked in small groups about how they got different codes, but how, different people will see different things, and all of that is legitimate and valid, but there's still kind of a right and wrong answer. So a messy, kind of scary topic if you're a student potentially. So the way we scaffolded this is multi-part, similar to the other example. And we started with a video of watching me coding, or just how to code, and then a video of watching me actually do coding. And then they practiced coding, and then they did the hypothesis as the final activity. And we'll walk through each of these. So this is the first, I guess so after they watch a video just about how to do qualitative coding, they then watch a video of me doing coding in real time. So basically it's kind of annotating a Word document to identify initial open codes to see, how could this be done? Because again, it's quite different to just read about it versus actually watch somebody go through the process in real time. And for the transcripts, we pulled some sample transcripts from an oral history project that was fully de-identified. Well, it was a non-IRB issue. I'll just put it that way. And then they got to practice on their own in a low stakes activity. So the grading here was pretty much, did you try? And really at this point, they were given another transcript from that same data set that I sample coded. And then they're asked to just read it once. And then the second time, start annotating it with what would become open codes if we were actually coding this. So they got to practice it. And this initial coding was done in Word or annotating a PDF, just because that's what you would kind of do in real life if you were doing open coding. And then here's where the hypothesis piece comes in. So I also coded that same transcript and uploaded my coding to hypothesis so they could see how I read it and what codes I developed. And then they were asked to look at my coding and reflect on the distinctions there. So that is both, how our codes might differ in terms of phrasing, but also, did I code something they missed? Or did they code something that I missed? And acknowledging the fact that each of us are approaching this in a different way with different lenses and different insights. And there is kind of a right and a wrong in terms of missing stuff. but there's also a lot of ambiguity and flexibility as to what could be an appropriate code. And so, again, this was previously done synchronously, and I think this really allowed us to capture that level of engagement and reflection in an asynchronous format. And let me show you now some of those example comments people made. So you can see here in these examples that people are kind of openly admitting instances where they missed stuff, which can be really hard to do, especially if you think about like a Zoom session of people together, unmuting and saying, oh, I missed something. That's hard to do. But people in an asynchronous format felt comfortable saying, I wasn't quite doing this right, or I think I went a little too broad. And then someone else could chime in and say, I also went too broad, and here's what I was thinking. So it allowed them to see steps where they missed something, and also to admit that in kind of a safe space where they could relate to that. And then in these examples, they're kind of sharing insights that they had. So again, some admissions of missing stuff, but also, hey, I applied this code, and someone else says, I also coded this part. So again, they can see my example, not necessarily as like the right thing, but more as here's how one person did this. And then they're asked to share how they did it, and they can also see how their peers shared about their coding to really capture the fact that the ambiguity is inherent and there will be differences, and that's okay. So overall, I think students had a really good experience with this, and it helped me feel like I was keeping the level of engagement that I had in the prior synchronous version of the class.
Thank you. So excellent. I love that example. Julia, go ahead.
Amazing. So, from those two case studies, it's clear that annotation is not one size fits all, sort of like the coding that Linnea talked about. The key to making it work is designing prompts that are grounded in your field or your domain, but more so focused on student reflection and their emotional and cognitive needs. So in this table, you could see a variety of discipline examples, but what's important to notice is that while each prompt supports UDL and SEL goals, it's because it's aiming to reduce that confusion, encourage reflection, build confidence, and make space for connection between students, like we saw in both of the examples. So if you look at psychology, for example, the two example prompts is how does this theory align or conflict with your lived experience? And what terms needs more explanation? So you're not just necessarily giving them a reading and asking them, what's the name of the clinic? It's not about recalling specific information that, about the reading itself or about the resource. It is more so asking them how to connect their lived experience to the material and how can their lived experience differ or be similar to their partner in the class. So really trying to mimic that roundtable conversation you would have in a in-person or asynchronous course, and allowing them to have this metacognitive process where they're connecting their future careers, the theory they need to know, to their lives. So what does this all show us? We want to ensure that our annotations are made to reduce cognitive load, to scaffold these readings and these resources through modeling, collaboration, and meaning making. And most importantly, create an inclusive and supportive learning community for students, whether they're in person or asynchronous online. Which, more simply put, the annotation can be the most humanizing part of your online course. I would love to have a little bit of a discussion. I know we're running low on time, so either you could type in the chat or I just leave you with this question, but how can you envision social annotations supporting your classroom?
Let me see if I can get to the question. Oh, here's a question and answer. Sorry
Okay,
about
got
that.
it.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. Yeah, so Elizabeth asks, Linnea, how did you find the time required to read and review all the annotations? Did you provide global feedback at the end of the process or feedback to individual students?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's how I reckon this. So everybody got individual feedback on the coding that they did for themselves. For the hypothesis activity, I reviewed all of the annotations collectively and developed like a 2-paragraph kind of summary that everybody got as their feedback on that assignment because it felt like everybody could see everybody else's content anyway. So there was no reason not to kind of share overarching lesson with everybody. So it was hybrid, some personalized feedback, some general feedback.
Great. Excellent. And then Jeremy asks, I think the aspect of creating community in the asynchronous space is really important. Agreed. Let's see. Robin, I would love to get a copy of the slides and could definitely see using annotation and asynchronous in asynchronous info in the classroom, getting students to share study tips, life, work, school balance, and experiences with when they are frustrated and knowing where something came from. Yeah, absolutely. Super useful and thank you. Slides will be made available. Yes, and we absolutely can make these slides available to you. Patrick asks, how does Linnea provide those 2 paragraphs in hypothesis itself?
Yeah, so we have hypothesis integrated more or less into Canvas, which means it shows up in our grade book. So we can kind of see each person's individual annotations as well as all of them depending on the toggle settings. But basically the overall summary feedback went into Canvas. So everybody would get the email saying to please read the feedback. I don't necessarily think people are inclined to go back to the hypothesis assignment to look at it again after they finished it. So putting it in Canvas seemed more static. And then the next question is, how do you grade this activity? So for mine, at least for the hypothesis, it was really a simple, like, did you try and was it reflective? Full credit. Like there wasn't a whole lot of granularity on that. So these are all pretty low stakes on the way to a bigger kind of research project that's graded in a more detailed manner later.
And with the other assignment, it's similar. There was a rubric for all the elements of the social work assignment. Each one had a rubric, but it's a very simple rubric. In all the cases, it was like a 2-part rubric. Essentially, you did it well, you didn't do it well. And at the graduate level, most students are getting you did it well, and then just a description of what clarifies you did a good job or you didn't do a good job. So a very simple rubric, but giving them a rubric that helps them better understand how the grading is being implemented. Anne asks what kind of experience, if any, about the application to the information discipline itself, such as engaging students to choose articles so that they are locating more than 1 or 2, but picking out the best. There have been some instructors who've used hypothesis to have students generate their own articles. I'm trying to remember if there's a specific example that I can give, but it sounds like a great idea. If you've got some information about that, we'd love to hear about it, Anne. A valuable learning activity, Karen says a valuable learning activity and imagining how you can use it. Excellent. Yeah, and then thank you for your responses.
Well, I hate to wrap things up because it's very lively in the chat, which is amazing. Thank you, all 3 of you, for being here today and such a great session. I will let everyone go now so they can make it to our next session, hopefully on time. And we'll make sure to post the recording and see if we can get the slides as well to share with the attendees.
Yep,
Thank you all
absolutely.
again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.